On behalf of the Archives Committee, I'd like to welcome Buddy Kirk this morning for an interview. We're going to talk about his experiences in the Vietnam War. And Buddy, we want to thank you for serving your country and for serving this church. So when I do these interviews, I sort of like to get your background and like where you were born and where you grew up and the things that led you to end up being in the U.S. Army, and then talk about some of your experiences while in the Army. So could you just sort of give us a rundown of where you started?
Okay. I grew up born in Brunswick, Georgia. Grew up there and thought I wanted to make a career in the military, and thought North Georgia College was a good way to start there. So that's basically how I got to North Georgia College, and went there 4 years and graduated in 1964 and had a commission as a second lieutenant in the artillery with the U.S. Army, and was commissioned a regular Army officer because I had intentions of making the career in the Army my career. And so that's basically how that transpired.
Well, tell us about when you went in and where you were and the things that you went through while you were in the military, and about your experiences in Vietnam, if you would.
Okay. Well, actually, when we graduated in '64, June 1st, I think it was, actually I was commissioned, and so I went directly into the Army at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. I was assigned to the 101st Airborne Division, artillery branch, and went to Fort Campbell, Kentucky for about a month or so. And then, of course, being airborne, you had to go to Fort Benning for airborne training. So in August, I went to Fort Benning. It's about if I recall, about a 5-week training time. 4 weeks are extensive ground training about parachutes and those kind of things, and how to fall and how to hold yourself, that kind of thing. And then the last week was 5 jumps, where we made 5 jumps out of I think at that time it was a C-119, which was a nice plane to jump out of back in. So we jumped 5 times, and then you get your wings. You're qualified as a parachutist. And I went back to Fort Campbell, and then you have to go to whatever your branch is. You have to go to school to train in that field. So artillery training was in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And prior to that, Polly and I got married in September of '64. And we went to Fort Sill. I think that was about a 5-month training where you basically train on how to shoot howitzers and that kind of thing. And we did that, and then came back to Fort Campbell for about, I guess, 6 months. And then at that time, they were sending troops to Vietnam, and I had heard stories about there were 2 ways to go to Vietnam. One, you could go as an advisor with the Vietnamese Army, and I'd heard some tales about that didn't appeal to me, being left out in the fields and no support, that kind of thing. So about that same time, one of the brigades at Fort Campbell, 1st Brigade, was assigned to Vietnam. So I volunteered to go with the artillery unit, a battalion that was going with that brigade. I think I was in the 319th, and the 320th was going with the brigade. So I volunteered to go because my rationale was that I'd rather be with my own troops and in that kind of situation. So we went to Vietnam in 1965. and I was there a year. I was a forward observer assigned to a infantry unit, and of course the way that worked, the infantry went out in the field looking for the Viet Cong and that kind of thing, and of course I was the artillery observer that if they needed artillery fire, then my responsibility was to call that fire in, and did that several times. I was a second lieutenant, and 6 months later I was promoted to first lieutenant, and as a first lieutenant you come out of the field and you go to the artillery battery as a fire direction control officer, which is the one that's responsible for receiving the commands from the FO out in the field and converting it to a direction to turn the guns and then to fire. And so I was in that position for 6 months, and then that's where when I left, that's the job I left when I came back to the States. I actually came back to the States to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, which was kind of unusual because I had requested 5 other locations, but they felt like that I needed to go back there, and I ended up being a training officer for a company to train people to go back to Vietnam. So I did that for about a year, and then I was promoted to captain and was on the G1 staff, which was actually a great job. I was responsible for officer assignments that came in to Fort Campbell. Very good job. In fact, I've often joked that had I had that job forever, I would have stayed in the Army. Obviously, that couldn't happen. But so I stayed until I think 1968, and then we left the Army, and I went to work with Milligan. And it was in Clemson, South Carolina, and then from there, a year there, they decided to relocate some equipment to LaGrange, and so we got to come back to LaGrange.
When you were in Vietnam, what stage in the life of that war was it? Was that early?
It was early, yeah.
What I thought.
I think it actually started something like early '64, maybe even '63 with advisors, but the real Army buildup began in late '64, '65, and so I was part of that big buildup.
You never had to go back again?
No, I didn't.
Well,
in fact, I was a regular Army officer, and my commitment was 3 years. And when I came back, I decided to get out. But they said, well, we need Army officers, so we're going to extend you involuntarily for another year because they needed officers to stay in. But they told me after I got back after the first tour that I wouldn't go back, so that's why I decided to get out.
Well, your experiences in Vietnam and what, about 4 years in the Army? Is that about what you served active duty?
Right.
Sort of give us an idea about what your opinion is of what this 4 years did, and as far as your career that followed. Do you feel like it was a good basis? A lot of things you learned that were very good to help you in the rest of your working career?
Well, I think the Army is a good, it's a good discipline builder. I think that helped me a lot. I think you meet a lot of interesting personalities in the Army, some good, most good, fortunately, some not so good. But the ones that were good, I remember the influence they had on me because I was impressed by the way they carried themselves, their honesty, and how they got things done. And I think that was a big influence on me when I was young. I was 23 years old, 23 or 24. And I think those kind of things stayed with me as I made the transition out into business. And of course, in business, I went into management, and I think the Army, being an Army officer, prepared me probably fairly significantly for those positions on. And then, of course, all through my professional life, I was with Milliken, I think, for 9 years, and then I went to work with Interface here with Ray Anderson for about 28 years. And all that was in management positions, and I think the Army was a basis for building my background to go into and to pursue those kind of positions.
Anything that went on in Vietnam while you were there, any of the combat and all, any of that you care to touch on?
Well, you've heard the old saying in war that it's times of boredom broken by moments of sheer terror, and that is true. I can remember many days where we basically just sat, laid around, read, played touch football, just passed the time. And then there would be times where you were up and you were at it, and there was a fight here and you had to go. That being in the airborne, we didn't, the terrain and that kind of thing didn't lend itself to the strategic use of airborne troops, in other words, jumping. But we went, everywhere we went basically was with helicopters. And I told the story many times that I flew in helicopters so many times that I actually thought I could fly one. That's not true, but I felt like I could because I saw what the pilots did and that kind of thing. But everywhere we went in Vietnam, we moved by helicopters. I was in some fairly serious battles. It's interesting how fate leads you to one to another, but when I was a second lieutenant for 6 months as a forward observer, which is probably the most dangerous position for an artillery officer, because you're out with the infantry, which and I give them all the credit in the world, because that is the most dangerous branch, because they're right there fighting directly. But I was in that position for 6 months, and when I rotated back to the battery as a fire direction control officer, the lieutenant that replaced me, and I'll never forget his name, Lieutenant Fox, was killed shortly after he replaced me, which was kind of sobering, thinking about how things work that way. And then when I was a fire direction control officer, my fire direction control technician, who is really your right-hand man, he's a non-commissioned officer, but he's really the fire direction control's top technician, was killed with a mortar round. And right after I rotated, the soldier that was my radio operator when I was a forward observer was also killed. So you think about people that have been close to you, and the fact that they were killed and you weren't, gets you to thinking, and asking why and how does that work. But fortunately, I had some close calls, but I had no wounds, maybe mental wounds, but no physical wounds. So I'm glad for that.
I know during most of the Vietnam War, certainly later on, myself and many of my friends and people that have similar thoughts about the war were very disturbed at the way these veterans that came back from Vietnam were treated by a lot of these people that opposed the war so much, like it was their doing to have started that war. And I was very disappointed and those people in our country that took that position. And I know there was a lot of negative feelings about the war in general, and I'm sure you're aware of all that. Do you have any opinions you'd like to express about the Vietnam War in general?
Well, I just, as we mentioned earlier, when we were down in the Welcome Center, my only concern about it was that we had over 56,000 soldiers killed, and I can't, for the life of me, see what we've done, what that accomplished for us. Because we all came back, and then as soon as we came back, the North Vietnamese took over South Vietnam. So you got to really ask the question, what was the purpose? And I have regrets about that, because I just didn't see that we accomplished anything. But you know, you do what you're, as a soldier, what you're commanded to do, and that's it. But I remember coming home, flying home in '66. I was on a regular passenger flight from Vietnam, from Saigon. I didn't sense any animosity toward me, because I'm sure the people that were on that plane knew, you know, where I'd been and that I was coming home, but I never sensed any of that. I think afterwards, when you were exposed to radio and television, you got a bigger sense of what was going on, but it was just not a popular war. And I think, and I have to agree with a lot of that sentiment that, you know, people didn't think we ought to be there, and I sort of felt that same way, but I was.
Well, thank you for your remarks in that regard, and thank you for this interview. Anything else you'd like to express about all the good times after that in LaGrange and other places that you've been as outside of the military?
Well, it is, as I mentioned, how fate takes its course. The things that happened to me and how I was protected in Vietnam, came home, went to Clemson, South Carolina with Milliken, and really didn't particularly like Clemson, but in all our families, Polly's and my family, all in Georgia, and when we had I remember my boss came to me and said, we got an opening in LaGrange, Georgia, would you be interested in going? And of course we jumped at it because we were coming home, and so we that was a delightful time in our lives. And of course we've been here now, gosh, 40 years, I guess. And I remember when I was, one of the things that motivated me to consider going with Interface in 1977 was Milliken at that time transferred people a lot. And I thought that they were going to transfer me back to South Carolina at some of our plants there, and I didn't particularly want to do that. So Ray Anderson was our Sunday school teacher here at that time, and apparently Ray was impressed with me for some reason and asked me to come to work for him at Interface in 1977, which we did, which not only was I thought a lot of Ray, but it was also an opportunity for us to stay in LaGrange, hopefully for the rest of our lives, which is really what happened. So those are some fond memories that we always will keep with us.
Well, I know Interface, I'm very familiar with the beginnings and Ray Anderson and all of this because I remember it well. And I will have to say that Interface has been a very, very supportive industry in this town and has always been an asset, and I'm sure always will be, and we're just glad they're still very strong.
Oh yeah, great company.
And gosh, we thank you for this interview, and we thank you so much for your service to your country in a very dangerous situation during the Vietnam War, and we're certainly proud that you survived it all And we thank you for this interview, and anything else you'd like to say before we end the interview?
No, I just I appreciate the opportunity. There was times when I didn't want to talk about it, but because it was just it's kind of gory kind of stuff. But over the years, I've made that transition to where I'm able to talk about it, and glad to do it here. And I appreciate the opportunity.
And we thank Paul Barnes for doing this interview technically. And I mentioned that a copy of this tape, we'll have a copy for you, and one will go in our church library for anybody to look at that wants to look at it, and one will go to our archives office, archives room here in the church, and another one downtown to the historical museum. Buddy Kirk, we thank you for being with us today, and we thank you for your serving your country, and we thank you for all the wonderful service you've given to First Baptist Church.
Thank you, Jude.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.